Welcome to the Theology Made podcast. I'm Jordan. Today, we're going to look at the Empire of Relics. It's Paris, 1200 AD. A velvet-draped table stands in the heart of the marketplace. Behind it, a merchant lifts a tiny slither of wood high into the light. This, he proclaims, is no ordinary scrap. It is a piece of the true cross, the very wood on which our Lord was crucified. Ripples through the crowd. Pilgrims surge forward. Pouches open, coins clink. Someone whispers that with this relic, prayers will be answered faster, sins forgiven quicker. Another swears it can heal the sick. A chronicler, watching all this, shakes his head.
There are so many pieces of the cross in Europe. One could build a ship.
The crowd doesn't care. They want a piece of eternity in their hands. Because in the Middle Ages, holiness wasn't just believed. It was bought, sold, and carried home. This is the story of the Empire of Relics, a medieval marketplace where bones, blood, and wood became the currency of faith. So what exactly is a relic? At its simplest, a relic is anything touched by holiness. A bone from a saint's body, a lock of hair, a vial of blood, a piece of clothing, even dust from a martyr's tomb. In the early centuries, when Christians were persecuted, believers gathered secretly in catacombs to pray over the graves of martyrs. These bones weren't seen as trophies, they were testaments, visible proof that faith was worth dying for. When Constantine legalized Christianity in the 4th century, relics, they moved into the open. Catacombs gave way to basilicas. Bones were sealed inside altars. Soon, no church was considered consecrated unless a relic rested beneath it. Holiness wasn't abstract anymore. It was tangible. You could touch it, see it, carry it. And once holiness could be carried, it could also be traded. Relics made the invisible visible. They made eternity physical, but they also made faith material. And that material could be measured, guarded, stolen, bought, and sold. And by the medieval era, relics had become Europe's obsession. Pilgrim routes formed a web across the continent, from Spain, England, Germany, Rome, Jerusalem. Each shrine promised miracles. Each shrine claimed relics, and pilgrims, they came by the tens of thousands. Pilgrims meant offerings. Offerings meant wealth. Wealth meant prestige. Prestige meant power, and power meant you need more relics. And they weren't just devotional items. They were an economy. Think of it this way. If gold was the currency of kings, relics were the currency of heaven. And their value wasn't in weight, but in belief. If people believed that a saint's finger bone cured fevers, it was priceless. If they doubted it, it was worthless. The market ran on faith. It's a medieval version of crypto, rising and falling on confidence. And like crypto, the relic market was volatile. One bishop might unveil a new relic, say the tunic of the Virgin Mary, and suddenly his city was flooded with pilgrims. But another bishop could denounce that relic as fake, and the flood would dry up overnight. Entire local economies rose and fell on whether a bone was believed. Some churches became relic entrepreneurs. They competed to collect the rarest, holiest objects. Priests traveled across Europe hunting them down. Kings paid fortunes to acquire them. And the more relics you had, the more pilgrims came, and the more pilgrims came, the more money poured into your town. Inns thrived, markets swelled, roads buzzed with life. A holy bone could do what no tax decree could: revive an economy. And this was more than devotion. It was a spiritual stock market. And the dividends, they weren't only spiritual, they were political, social, economic. Because relics, they built cathedrals, they filled treasuries, and they made cities famous. Relics were power. And by the High Middle Ages, Europe was drowning in relics. Every cathedral wanted them, every abbey advertised them, every town hoped for one that would put them on the map. Now, some relics, they were plausible. The saint's bones carefully guarded since martyrdom, a tunic worn by a bishop, a chalice from a church father. But others, they stretched the imagination. Because at least 3 cities claimed to possess the head of John the Baptist. Several monasteries swore they had vials of the Virgin Mary's breast milk, sealed in glass and displayed like jewels. A dozen towns paraded fragments of the true cross, each insisting theirs was authentic. And there was even a relic that made theologians blush: the holy foreskin of Christ. At least 7 different churches claim to have preserved it, and some argue for over 30. Which begs the question, whose foreskin did they have? And then came feathers from Gabriel's wings, bread from the Last Supper, even a rock that supposedly cried out when Christ entered Jerusalem. If heaven had ever touched earth, someone had bottled it and put it behind glass. And the cravings for relic, this wasn't just pious, it was desperate, because medieval life was fragile. Plague, famine, war, death lurked everywhere. A relic felt like insurance. If you could touch a saint's bone, maybe your child would live through the fever. If you prayed before Mary's milk, maybe your crops would survive the frost. Relics, they weren't just souvenirs, they were promises, these tangible, physical pledges that the divine was near, that holiness had a hotline to heaven. And so the relic rush, it intensified. Monks went on expeditions to the Holy Land, returning with sacks of stones and wood chips, each labeled as sacred. Priests stole bones from rival monasteries. Even kings joined the hunt. One 9th century abbot confessed to digging up a saint's tomb at night, spiriting the bones away, and reburying the coffin with decoys. His defense? I wasn't stealing. I was translating the saint to a worthier home. But here's the kicker. People knew some relics were fake. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, it satirizes it perfectly. His partner brags of selling pig bones as saintly relics, duping peasants along the road. Everyone laughed, and still everyone bought. Because relics, they didn't work by logic, they worked by faith. And a relic's power wasn't in carbon dating or DNA. Its power was the collective belief of the community. If pilgrims believed the bones were holy, then miracles followed. If they doubted, the power dried up. Relics were just medieval NFTs, worthless without the story, but they became priceless with it. And the church leaned into the theater. Relics were displayed not in dusty boxes. They were enshrined in gold, shaped like arms, feet, or entire miniature cathedrals. Some were paraded through the streets on feast days. Some bled drops of oil. Some were said to glow. And the more spectacular the relic, the more pilgrims came. The more pilgrims came, the more money flowed. And soon, relic mania, it was a continent-wide obsession. And in a world without antibiotics, insurance, modern science, relics filled the gap. They were the medieval hospital bank, therapy session, and lottery ticket. A relic could heal, could protect, it could absolve. But most of all, a relic could give people hope in a world where hope was scarce. And that's what made relics so dangerous, because when hope itself becomes currency, the temptation to counterfeit it is irresistible. Relics didn't just shape private piety, they reshaped kingdoms. To possess a great relic was to possess a kind of divine endorsement. It said, God is with us, not them. Take Louis IX of France, the king who would later be canonized as St. Louis. In 1239, he purchased one of the most famous relics in history, the crown of thorns. It is said to have pierced Christ's brow. He bought it from the Latin emperor of Constantinople, who needed the cash. And the price was astronomical, 135 livres. That is more than the construction of a Louvre. But for Louis, it wasn't just a purchase, it was a coronation in miniature. By wearing the French crown while possessing Christ's crown, he fused his monarchy with Christ's suffering, and France became the new Holy Land. And he built a chapel just to house it, Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. Visitors entered, looked up, and they were overwhelmed by light. The message, it was unmistakable. This is where heaven touches earth. This is where Christ's passion lives on. This is the kingdom God favors. Relics didn't just consecrate cathedrals. They marched to war. Armies carried saint bones into battle. Banners were stitched with relics. One crusade chronicler describes how soldiers kissed the relic before charging, believing no sword could pierce them while God's saints were near. And sometimes they were right. Victories were credited not to strategy but to relics. A saint's arm had intervened. A fragment of the true cross had shielded arrows. Relics were divine insurance policies on the field of blood. But relics also played a quieter, more insidious role: diplomacy. You want to cement an allegiance? Gift a relic. Want to bind a monastery's loyalty? Promise them bones. Want to prove legitimacy as a ruler? Display the relic at your coronation. Kings hoarded relics like we hoard nuclear weapons. To possess them was to project power. One 10th century emperor refused to recognize a rival's authority until he produced his relic as proof of God's favor. Another pope sent relics as diplomatic gifts to kings across Europe. Each bone or piece of cloth was a reminder: your power depends on me. And it wasn't just kings. Whole cities defined themselves by relics. Cologne's identity revolved around its prize, the relic of the three wise men. When pilgrims flooded in to see it, their economy boomed. Its cathedrals rose, financed by offerings. Santiago de Compostela in Spain became a global destination because of its claim to house the remains of St. James the Apostle. The pilgrimage route became so famous it still draws thousands today, not just as an exercise, but as a spiritual economy still paying dividends. A relic, it could put a city on the map. Literally, without relics, Cologne was a riverside town. With relics, it became a holy empire. And behind all of this was a conviction, however manipulated, that God's power was not abstract. It was locatable, portable, and embodied. To own a relic was to own a channel of grace. To touch it was to touch eternity, which meant that relics weren't just devotional objects. They were instruments of control. Whoever controlled the relics controlled the narrative. God is with us, not with you. And they didn't just inspire the faithful. They legitimized kings, consecrated cities, and even decided wars. They were the currency of medieval power. But like every empire built on fragile foundations, cracks began to show. Not all relics were holy. Many were stolen, many were forged, and some were just downright ridiculous. Relics were so valuable that monks and abbots sometimes turned into thieves. A 19th century story tells of monks from France who coveted the bones of Saint Foy, a child martyr. They plotted, infiltrated a rival abbey where the relics were kept, and they patiently waited for 10 years. Finally, when trust was earned, they stole the bones, smuggled them home, and installed them in their own shrine. Pilgrims flocked, offerings poured in. The monks, they didn't call it theft. They called it translation. They were moving the saint to a worthier resting place. In their eyes, the saint herself wanted to be stolen. And if you couldn't steal a relic, you could always fake one. Pig bones became saint bones. Common wood became fragments of the true cross. Animals' blood was bottled as martyrs' blood. Entire workshops cranked out counterfeits, knowing desperate pilgrims would pay. And the market was saturated. By the 13th century, Europe was brimming with enough relics to populate an army of saints. A chronicler remarked dryly that if
all the heads of John the Baptist were gathered together, he would be a monster with many faces.
And the satire was irresistible. Chaucer captured it perfectly in the Canterbury Tales. His partner brags to fellow pilgrims about his collection. A pillowcase he swears is the Virgin Mary's veil. A pig's bone he sells as a saint's relic. He admits it's all fake, but it doesn't matter. People still pay. And Chaucer wasn't just mocking one corrupt seller. He was mocking an entire culture hooked on relics even when they knew better. Why did people buy them? Why keep pouring money into a system full of fraud? Because the need was real. When your child burned with fever and the local physician offered herbs and prayers, but you wanted more. If a relic promised healing, you didn't ask too many questions. When plague swept your village, when war burned your fields, when death lurked everywhere, you wanted a touch of heaven in your hand. And so you paid, even if you suspected the relic was fake. Even if the monk smiled too slyly, even if the pig bone rattled like a joke. Because hope, however fragile, is worth the coin. But the cost was high. Relics became indulgence machines. Pilgrims paid to view them, believing days were shaved off of purgatory. Relics became commodities, grace became merchandise. And theologians began to worry. Was salvation for sale? Was hope being hoarded and auctioned like gold? The very objects meant to embody holiness, now, they smelled of greed. Relics had begun as testimonies of martyrs, but by the late Middle Ages, too many had become tools of exploitation. And the cracks in the empire of relics were widening, because soon, a hammer would strike a church door in Wittenberg. On October 31st, 1517, Martin Luther's 95 Theses were nailed to the church door at Wittenberg. Most people remember it as an attack on indulgences. But at the heart of indulgences was the relic economy. Because indulgences weren't floating ideas. They were tied to objects. Pilgrims were promised time off of purgatory if they viewed and venerated relics and made the right donation. And in Wittenberg, Luther's own prince, Frederick the Wise, he had one of the largest relic collections in Europe. He owned over 19,000 relics, a twig from Moses' burning bush, straw from the manger in Bethlehem, a piece of bread from the Last Supper, a vial of Mary's milk, and of course, countless bones, teeth, and skull fragments of saints. Pilgrims flocked to see them every All Saints' Day. Viewing them, according to church teaching, could earn you indulgences. And to Luther, this wasn't piety, it was spiritual exhortation. Luther fumed. Grace is free. It's not parceled out through glass cases. He accused Rome of turning salvation into a marketplace. Christ's sacrifice, he said, was enough. To traffic in relics was to cheapen the cross. And his words, they hit. The Reformation unleashed fury against relics. Across Protestant lands, these places were smashed, bones tossed, shrines stripped bare, gold casings were melted down, entire treasuries of relic vanished in flames. To reformers, this wasn't vandalism, it was purification, a cleansing of the church from centuries of corruption. But for Catholics, it was desecration. These weren't just objects, they were sacred. To burn them was to insult the saints, to sever ties with heaven. The relic empire fractured along confessional lines. And overnight, entire economies crumbled. Pilgrimage routes dried up, inns shuttered, markets shrank. Cities that had thrived on relic tourism found themselves broke. The medieval stock market of holiness crashed. It was the 16th century Black Tuesday. Now, some relics survived. They were hidden away, smuggled across borders, guarded in Catholic strongholds. But the age of relic mania, it was over. From now on, Europe would be divided. Protestants rejected relics as superstition. Catholics doubled down, defending them as tangible channels of grace. But here's the irony. Luther wanted to destroy the relic economy. And in many ways, he exceeded. Yet, even among Protestants, the longing for relics never fully disappeared. They may not have kissed bones or venerated blood, but they treasured Luther's inkpot. They preserved Calvin's letters. They saved Bunyan's Bible. The instinct was the same, even today. Be honest. Wouldn't you like the Bible Charles Spurgeon or Billy Graham preached from? Relics tell us something uncomfortable and something true about the human heart. On the one hand, they show how easily faith can be corrupted. Grace, meant to be free, was carved into pieces and sold for profit. The empire of relics was as much about greed as it was about God. But on the other hand, relics expose something deep and universal. We are creatures who long for the tangible. We don't just want ideas, we want touch, taste. We want something in our hands. And in this, relics echo the heart of Christianity itself. At the center of the faith, it's not philosophy, but an event. God became flesh. The infinite clothed himself in skin and bone. Jesus touched, ate, wept, bled. Salvation was not abstract, it was embodied. So perhaps it's no surprise that Christians clung to bones and blood and wood. They were trying, however imperfectly, to stay connected to a faith that insists matter matters. The danger was always confusing the sign with the reality. A relic could remind you of God's nearness, but it couldn't replace him. It could point to holiness, but it was never the source of it. The bread and wine of the Eucharist remain the true Christian relic. Ordinary matter carrying extraordinary grace. Not fragments of saints to be bought and sold, but Christ himself given freely to all. We might scoff at medieval pilgrims chasing foreskins and feathers. But are we so different? We still preserve the Bibles of great preachers. We display C.S. Lewis's desk at museums. We line up to see the diary of Mother Teresa, the letters of Bonhoeffer, the shoes of Martin Luther King Jr. We still crave nearness. We still believe touch transfers power. The empire of relics collapsed, but the impulse behind it never left. And relics remind us of two truths in tension. First, faith is always tempted to turn grace into currency. Second, faith is always longing to touch the holy. The medieval church gave in to the first, and they built an empire that collapsed. But the longing of the second remains, because Christianity is not about escaping matter. It's about God redeeming it. Bones matter, dust matters, flesh matters. The true relic is not a splinter of wood or a vial of milk. It is a life transformed by the Spirit of God, a body raised in resurrection. And maybe that's a lesson for us. Holiness can't be bought, but it can be encountered, not in bone fragments or blood drops, but in the neighbors we serve, the bread we break, and the Spirit who makes ordinary life a vessel of eternity. Thanks for listening to the Theology Made podcast. If you enjoyed this, share it with a friend. Spread the word.